My father refused to walk me down the aisle because his golden daughter had a housewarming party that day, but he called me in desperation when I found a replacement. For a long time, I always knew that my parents loved my older sister Vicky more than me. She was the planned child, while I was the result of an accidental pregnancy just 10 months later. They probably didn't even want me, but they decided to go through with the pregnancy anyway. My mother's parents had passed away before I was born, but my father's parents were very much alive, so they took on a significant role in raising me. Grandma and grandpa were the constants in my life, providing the love and support I often felt was lacking from my own parents. I remember so many occasions when my parents would leave me behind with my grandparents and only take my sister on trips. When I was young, I didn't mind because it was fun living with my grandparents. But as I grew older, around 6 or 7 years old, I realized how unfair it all was. But my problem wasn't just with my parents, it was also with my sister Vicky. Although I didn't harbor resentment toward Vicky, I couldn't help but feel like an unwanted addition to the family. She knew this too, and made me feel like an outsider every day in my own home. She always competed with me for everything, whether it was grades, our parents' attention, or even the smallest achievements. It felt like a constant battle for validation, and I was always on the losing side because my parents preferred her. As a result, I felt really inferior, and we never truly understood each other. Our relationship seemed more like a perpetual competition, with her always coming out victorious. On one occasion, she wanted to befriend a group of girls, but since she was a nerd, she was too scared to approach them. One of the girls and I had our classes together, so I introduced her to the rest of the group, and we all used to hang out together. Vicky was so jealous of this that she made my parents talk to me about including her. Plus, whenever she was with us, she would try to pick fights. But my mother would call me selfish, while my father would say that she was my sister and I should look out for her. Reluctantly, I agreed and introduced Vicky to the rest of the girls. Now, Vicky doesn't have many friends, so she can seem overly enthusiastic, and she constantly tried to impress the girls in our group, often becoming annoying. Despite her efforts, she struggled to find her place among them, and the uncomfortable tension between Vicky and the other girls was always palpable. For example, one of the girls liked a boy, so Vicky took it upon herself to approach the boy and let him know the girl liked him. He laughed because he wasn't interested and then told everyone, which embarrassed the girl. After this, the girls clearly told me they didn't want me to bring Vicky to our hangouts anymore, so I agreed. However, Vicky didn't take it well. She threw a tantrum when she found out the girls didn't want anything to do with her and insisted to our parents that I shouldn't hang out with those bad girls either, since I was her sister and should stand up for her. I refused and told her it was her own fault, they didn't want to be her friends. But my parents, as usual, sided with her, giving me a lecture about how Vicky didn't have bad intentions and that I should try to convince the girls to forgive Vicky, but that if they didn't, then I should also distance myself from them. I refused and stood my ground. I enjoyed hanging out with them, and unlike Vicky, I wasn't going to jeopardize my friendships in any way. I told my parents I had had enough and that it wasn't my responsibility to find friends for Vicky. My parents got angry and turned their backs on me for weeks, but I'm glad I stood my ground. This group of girls has remained my friends to this day, and they're basically like sisters to me. I've cried with them, laughed with them, and shared some of the most significant moments of my life with them. That wasn't the only reason Vicky came to hate me. There was also another incident with a boy. She had a crush on a boy I had no idea about, and with whom I sat in some classes because we were friends. He tried to ask me to prom, but I politely declined because I was already going with someone I liked more. Later, when Vicky found out, she made a big fuss about it, telling my parents how I always took the things she wanted and that I was flirting with the boy, knowing how she had felt for months. She called me a bunch of unpleasant names that no one should say to their own sister, and told my parents how she wished I parents her sister. My mother sided with her, telling me that what I had done was wrong and that as her sister I should respect girl code. I tried to tell them that I wasn't even interested in the boy and had declined his invitation, so she was free to ask him if she wanted to, but Vicky refused to let it go. Looking back, I think she knew the boy would have rejected her anyway, so she just wanted to take it out on me because he had asked me instead of her. Once my dad took me out for ice cream, telling me he wanted to spend some father-daughter time with me. This had never happened before, so I was really happy. However, he started asking me a bunch of questions, like if my boyfriend and I were being careful, if my boyfriend came from a good family, or if my boyfriend and I were doing drugs. I was shocked by his line of questioning and asked him what he meant by all of it. That's when my dad revealed that Vicky had been making up stories telling my parents for months that I was doing drugs and drinking alcohol with my boyfriend. This was a complete lie, and I showed my dad my phone so he could see that Vicky was lying. Later, when my dad confronted her about all the lies, She tried to justify them by saying that no one our age just spends time with a boy without doing anything, and that I was hiding things from everyone. I was so angry that I yelled at her for trying to create unnecessary drama and told her it wasn't my fault she had no one to go out with, but she needed to stay out of my life. Vicky didn't take it well and hit me. This came out of nowhere since she had never been physically violent before. My nose started bleeding as I fell to the floor, clutching my face in pain. My parents rushed me to the hospital, and the whole time, they begged me not to press charges against Vicky, saying it would ruin her life. While I sat in the back seat, holding my face, Vicky didn't even care. She didn't even apologize. Later, when the nurse asked me about the incident, I told her the truth, and she called Child Protective Services KEEPS. My parents were furious with me for involving SEPS, seeing it as a betrayal of family loyalty. In their eyes, Vicky's actions were seen as a mere accident and an isolated incident that didn't warrant such drastic intervention. They pleaded with the authorities, insisting that Vicky wasn't a danger to me and that her actions were out of character. In the end, Vicky was released, but my parents were warned that they would be closely monitored in case any other accidents happened. As you can imagine, Vicky was really upset, as were my parents. Later, my parents told me they were disappointed in me for trying to ruin my sister's life. My mother started crying and told me how I was tearing the family apart by involving outsiders. My father's disappointment was palpable. He always had words full of reproach as he questioned my decision to escalate the situation. I firmly told them I wanted Vicky out of my life, and they agreed. I felt guilty for involving the authorities, but for the first time, I felt safe in my own home. Once Vicky had been formally warned, my parents had a separate conversation with her, and from that day on, she stopped talking to me completely. I prefer this much more than having her constantly hovering around me or trying to insert herself into my life. When my grandparents found out about this incident, they asked me to pack my things so I could live with them for the rest of high school. They informed my parents, who didn't protest much, so I went to live with my grandparents. Unlike my parents' home, I felt safe and loved there. The remaining days of high school went well, and I made lasting memories with my friends. My parents never visited me or called me during that time. I knew they were happy with their beloved daughter, so I never tried to contact them. Although it hurt that they could so easily discard me as if I were nothing, when I graduated from high school, my parents made the day all about Vicky. They didn't even congratulate me or approach me, and I felt like a stranger to them. However, my grandparents were there and scolded my parents for being so obvious about their favoritism. I don't know what my grandfather said to them, but my dad later awkwardly approached me and apologized. Later, I found out that I had been accepted into a good university with a full scholarship. I was very happy about this because I was afraid to ask my parents for financial help. I informed my grandparents about this, and they took me out to dinner at a nice restaurant. After dinner, my grandmother posted photos of me on her Facebook account, writing a long caption about how proud she was of me for being an exceptional student. Our relatives soon found out and joined in the congratulations. I guess some of them might have told my parents, who had no idea about any of this. Instead of being happy about it, my mother called me the next day to tell me that Vicky had locked herself in her room, crying because she hadn't been accepted into any university, and that I was consciously trying to make my sister feel bad about her grades by talking to all our relatives. She told me it was all my fault because apparently Vicky was depressed after the incident with SPEEPs, which had pushed her to get bad grades. I was so incredibly devastated that my own mother could blame me for something like this, so that was the last time I spoke to her. My grandparents helped me move into my university dorm. Because my high school boyfriend's university was far away from mine, we broke up, so I started college single. The breakup had been hard, but I was excited to meet new people. That's where I met Rob. He and I were both freshmen, and we both spent half our days in the library. Rob was different from anyone I had ever met before. He was a quiet person who liked to study, which was similar to me, and we quickly found common ground in our shared love for college. As the weeks turned into months, our friendship blossomed into something deeper, and I realized that I had developed feelings for Rob that went beyond mere friendship. Being outgoing, I was pretty straightforward about my feelings for Rob, and I was surprised to learn that he felt the same way. We started dating and have been together for 8 years. My grandparents have met Rob, and they absolutely adore him. I've met Rob's parents, who literally treat me like their own daughter. Sometimes, Rob's mother has even confided in me about how she always wished she had a daughter, so she's happy that Rob has found someone as wonderful as me. To be honest, this is the first time I've been surrounded by family members who appreciate me and don't hold a grudge against me. I've told Rob stories about my childhood, and he listens and knows about my relationship with Vicky. Over these past 8 years, my parents have barely contacted me, except to send an occasional birthday message if they remembered. But that's all. Recently, Rob and I got engaged. He proposed to me while we were hiking to our usual spot to watch the sunrise, and it was a dream proposal. It was so sweet to see how nervous he was when asking me the question, and I had no doubts in my mind when I accepted the proposal. I posted engagement photos on my Instagram and also informed my grandparents about it. They were so happy for me and congratulated us on our future. I guess the news must have spread because my parents called me out of the blue to congratulate me too. I thought it was just a casual conversation since we hadn't spoken in years. They asked me about my life, my job, and my apartment before my dad directly asked if he could walk me down the aisle. I was surprised by his sudden question, as just moments before, he didn't even know which company I worked for. I told him I hadn't thought about it yet, and my dad said it would be embarrassing if I didn't invite him, and that others would question us about it, so it would be better if he walked me down the aisle. I told my parents I didn't even know if I was going to invite them to my wedding since we hadn't been in contact, but this upset them. My mother started telling me how disappointed she was by my response, emphasizing the importance of family and tradition. She continued to tell me how they would always be my parents no matter what, and that I should let go of the past. Part of me was tempted to listen to my parents and accept my dad's offer because I wanted our relationship to be repaired. But another part of me hesitated, fearful of opening myself up to possible disappointments and hurts again. However, I was about to start a new chapter of my life in a few months, so I told my dad that he could walk me down the aisle, and he seemed delighted. During the wedding preparations, I contacted my high school friends with whom I had always kept in touch despite the physical distance that had grown between us due to our careers. I told them how I wanted the group to reunite and that I wanted them to be my bridesmaids. There were many tears of happiness and congratulations, and without hesitation, they accepted my invitation to be part of my bridal party, since it was an opportunity for us all to get together again. We all planned to go to Las Vegas to celebrate my bachelorette party, while Rob had a separate bachelor party with his friends as well. My friends and I posted a bunch of photos from the party, and overall, everyone had a great time. However, when I got home, my parents called to tell me how disappointed they were that I hadn't invited Vicky to be part of the celebration. I told them there was no way I would have involved Vicky in my bachelorette party and that I didn't want her to be part of my life. This surprised my parents and they asked me what I meant, so I clarified that Vicky's actions, particularly her history of lies and gossip, had left me deeply hurt and distrustful of her intentions. I couldn't imagine inviting her to such an intimate and joyful occasion as my bachelorette party, knowing that her presence would make my party less happy. I also informed my parents that this was why she wasn't invited to my wedding either. Upon hearing this, my parents lost their temper, complaining that I had no right to exclude my sister from my wedding, and that it was my duty as her sister to include her in such important events. They told me that Vicky was excited to meet me after hearing that I was getting married. I was confused and asked my parents what gave her that idea since we hadn't even spoken in a long time. But my parents ignored my concerns, saying that's not how sisters behave. I told them they needed to understand that my relationship with Vicky is complicated. After everything that's happened, I simply don't feel comfortable having her as part of my wedding. Not even once has she apologized to me for everything she put me through. However, my parents generally ignored my words. My mother kept saying how she wanted everything to be resolved and that I should make an effort to invite Vicky. My father insisted that our relatives would talk about why my sister wasn't invited and that this would end up affecting my wedding. However, I knew it was better not to give in to their demands, so I didn't give in to them. I told them it was okay if people talked behind my back and questioned my character as long as I was surrounded by people I liked and trusted during my wedding. My mother then asked if my fiancé would be okay with this, and also tried to play the in-laws card, saying they would judge me for being so incredibly cruel as to exclude my own sister from my wedding. I laughed and informed my parents that my fiancés and my in-laws were aware of my family dynamics and that none of them would care whether Vicky was present or not. They pressured me further, suggesting the importance of family unity and forgiveness, but I didn't budge an inch because I wasn't willing to compromise my own well-being just to appease others. In the end, we agreed to disagree, each of us holding on to our own perspectives, and my parents told me they needed to think things over, and we ended our conversation there. I informed my grandparents about this because I felt a bit guilty for standing up to my parents, and they fully supported me. My grandparents told me I shouldn't be forced to invite anyone I didn't want there, and that my parents, as usual, were trying to make me feel guilty. Since that conversation, I felt a little better about my decision and have distracted myself with wedding preparations. As my wedding quickly approached, my dad called me last week to inform me that he had thought it over and that he and mom would no longer be attending the wedding. Before I could react, he continued by saying that this also meant he wouldn't be walking me down the aisle. I asked if there was a specific reason, and he informed me that Vicky would be moving into a new place soon that my parents had helped her find, and since I was excluding her from the wedding, she had decided to host a housewarming party on the same day, so they would be attending that instead of my wedding. I couldn't believe what my father was telling me because he hadn't even been invited in the first place, much less was he going to walk me down the aisle, but he considered telling me that it was him who decided not to do so. However, the idea that my own sister's housewarming party took priority over my wedding was a hard blow, one that continued the feeling I had had for years. I simply told him I understood and hung up the call. Even though I tried to act brave in front of my father, deep down the pain of rejection affected me. When I told Rob, he was furious at how insensitive my parents could be, especially after they were the ones who insisted on being invited. He was the one who suggested that I should ask my grandfather since he and grandma had basically been there for me more than my parents. I agreed. So I called my grandparents and asked if they would be willing to walk me down the aisle at my wedding. I couldn't hold back my emotions as I asked my grandfather, "You and grandma have always been there for me," I said with my voice cracking with emotion. "You've been more than just grandparents to me, you've been like parents, and I can't imagine anyone else I'd want by my side on my wedding day." My grandfather didn't hesitate before saying yes. He told me how honored he would be to walk me down the aisle, and unlike my parents, he wouldn't let me down. His words reassured me, and at that moment, I felt a deep sense of peace. With my grandparents by my side, I knew I had a family that loved me unconditionally and accepted me just as I am, with all my imperfections. I also talked to my father-in-law about this, and Rob's parents assured me they didn't care if my parents didn't attend, and that regardless of their presence, they were delighted to witness and support our union. My wedding is in 2 days, and today I woke up to several missed calls from my dad. I called him back, thinking it was an emergency, and when he answered, he asked if it was true that my grandfather would be walking me down the aisle. I told him yes, it was true, and then my dad became furious, saying how disrespectful it was for me to ask my grandfather. I reminded him how he was the one who decided not to come to my wedding, so I didn't understand why he was so upset. My dad continued yelling at me about how he and mom were just trying to make me see the error of my ways, and that they thought by declining the invitation, they would teach me a lesson. He went on to say how he and mom had raised me and paid for my food and education, so my grandfather had no right to replace him. I tried to reason with him, explaining that my grandfather had been there for me in ways that he and mom never were, but he didn't want to listen. He also told me how I had done nothing but push everyone away from me, and that this was all my fault. I don't think I've done anything wrong in this situation. I suppose anyone would have done the same, but since the subreddit requires me to ask the question, am I the bad one for asking my grandfather to walk me down the aisle instead of my father?